reactive work almost never creates value. And unless we're giving people time to do proactive work, we're hiring them and then not letting them create any value.
You're listening to the Profit by Design podcast, episode 62. You work hard in your business. On the Profit by Design podcast, we ask the big question: what has your business done for you lately? Hi, I'm Dr. Sabrina Starling, the business psychologist, the author of How to Hire the Best, and your co-host on the Profit by Design podcast. Weekly, my co-host, Mike Bruno, and I bring you tips, tools, and strategies from our own experiences and from the experiences of our guests, who are entrepreneurial thought leaders and real-life entrepreneurs, all to support you in making intentionally profitable and sustainable business decisions to live the lifestyle you desire. We are nearing the end of 2019, and now is a great time to be taking stock of your business to get ready for 2020. Profit Designers, we have created a tool for you at Tap the Potential to help you identify the parts of your business that are strong and the parts of your business that need attention in order for you to have a highly profitable, great place to work that gives you your life back. You know, do things like take a 4-week vacation if you want to, or just have that freedom to do something else in your life that's important to you besides working all the time in your business. So if you want to get a handle on what to put attention to in 2020 to make your business sustainably profitable, to get your business where it can run without your daily involvement, take our assessment at tapthepotential.com/assessment. You will get feedback on what's strong in your business and what areas need the most attention from you in 2020. Again, you can take that at tapthepotential.com/assessment. Profit Designers, today I'm bringing you an interview with David Burkus. David's work was featured in my latest How to Hire the Best book, which is available at tapthepotential.com/book. I featured David's work because I was really struggling with an issue that I saw our business owners grapple with, and it was a bit of a stumbling block in building out their A-player attraction system. And that is how to really tap into the networks around them to attract A players. When I came across David's work in his book, Friend of a Friend, I was so excited because I saw the answers there. And I shared some of those answers with you in the How to Hire the Best book, but I'm really excited today to bring David on himself to fill us in on how to network based on human behavior and psychology and not rote networking advice that we hear over and over. And I also want to share with you that David has written more than just Friend of a Friend. He's also got a book out called Under New Management with somewhat radical management practices that we're actually using at Tap the Potential, and some of our clients are using too and having great success with. So I'm excited to be able to get into that with him as well, because I think it will open your eyes to making some of the management in front of you that you're dealing with a lot easier. David Burkus is a best-selling author, a sought-after keynote speaker, and associate professor of leadership and innovation. His newest book, Friend of a Friend, offers readers a new perspective on how to grow their networks and build key connections, one based on the science of human behavior, not rote networking advice. He's delivered keynotes to the leaders of Fortune 500 companies and the future leaders of the United States Naval Academy. His TED Talk has been viewed over 2 million times, and he is a regular contributor to Harvard Business Review. David, thank you for being here with me on the Profit by Design podcast to talk all about your book, Friend of a Friend. And as I was telling you as we were coming into the episode, you helped me solve a big problem that I was having as I was writing the next edition of How to Hire the Best. And that solution is in Friend of a Friend. So before we go there, I would love to have you talk a little bit about what inspired you to write Friend of a Friend and what's happened since you've written that book.
All right. Well, I don't know how much time we have, but sure. So there's two kind of simultaneous or the confluence of two different ideas that kind of led to Friend of a Friend. The first was that in both of my prior books, I have used studies from the world of network science, the people that study how people connect to each other, whether that's the whole world, 7.7 billion people, or whether that's an organization and the informal network behind the org chart, that type of thing. And so I've used those studies in the past, and I always find them fascinating. And so I sort of went on a deep dive, and I had interviewed a couple other people that were prominent researchers in the area. And I reached back out to them and I said, I want to learn more about network science. What are like the top papers that I need to read, right? And so I read a bunch of those. At the same time, I started to get really, really annoyed with what I call the networking advice books, right? They're all fine books and they're all full of good advice, but they all present a problem, which is that advice is autobiographical. Advice is how one guy, usually it's a guy or girl, did networking for their own career. And then the presumption is that because it worked for me, it'll work for you. And that presumption is really dangerous, right? And it leads to, not only will it not work a lot of the time, it leads to people going to that networking event, going to that conference, whatever it is, trying to implement the advice and then feeling sort of sleazy and inauthentic. And so my grand theory is that, of course you feel inauthentic. You're trying to be someone else in that moment because you're following that person's advice. So then we started getting this idea of okay, well, what if we taught people how networks worked so they could write their own advice? And how do you teach people how networks work? You rely on network science, which I had been reading about for the last, year and a half or 2 years. So that was the grand idea, right? There are these networking advice books, and they're good advice, but it's autobiographical. And then there's all this papers and books on network science, and they're fascinating, but not all that practical, right? And so we got to say, what if we could split the difference and go right in the middle with something that says, here's how networks work. Here's a rough idea of what you need to do, but you make it you make it authentic. You decide what questions to ask or who to reach out to or what your plan is. We're not going to give you a 90-day action plan. We're just going to say, here's how networks work. Figure out what you're missing and go after that.
That's so true, what you're saying about, all the advice that's written on networking. So I'll just say I'm an introvert and I hate all that advice. It just makes me cringe inside. It feels all slimy. And so when I read Friend of a Friend, first off, my reaction was this kind of fits with my experience. This is a language that summarizes what I've experienced in life. But as I alluded to at the beginning of our conversation, you helped me solve a big problem that I was dealing with, How to Hire the Best. So in How to Hire the Best, the first edition, I wrote that for rural business owners to attract A players into their small businesses. And what I was hearing them say over and over, they would say, I don't know how I got this A player into my business. It just happened. And then when I would dig a little further and say, well, tell me the story of how that happened, I would hear good networking. It was a friend of a friend or a family member or some connection. So there is, in the How to Hire the Best series, there is a strong reliance on networking. And as I'm working with these entrepreneurs to apply the How to Hire the Best strategy, one of the things that we see over and over is that A players hang together. So if you know one A player, you have access to a whole network of A players. However, when it comes to attracting A players into these businesses, the business owners sometimes feel well, I've exhausted all my network. I've asked everybody I know. Nobody knows a person who could be a great fit for this role. And what I really appreciate in Friend of a Friend is the concept of, really, when it comes down to it, we're about 4 degrees of separation from other people, anybody else on the planet. And we can take shortcuts to get into other networks besides our own, and that it is our distant connections, people who we may not be interacting with all the time, who may be more distant in our networks, or people who are older connections that we've lost a connection with, who can actually be the most valuable to us in our network. So I would love to have you speak about that concept.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you said it perfectly, right? People, and I get this a lot too. People go, oh, well, who else do I ask? I've asked everyone I know. No, you haven't. You almost never haven't. You've asked everyone you know that it's convenient for you to ask because you have a strong enough relationship with that person where you're not uncomfortable asking them, right? But as time goes by and we lose touch with certain people, it feels more awkward to reach back out to them after it's been a year, 2 years, whatever. And so we either forget that we know them or we just don't even consider them as the list of people that I know, right? And then there's also, like you said, the people that so we use a term in network science for that called dormant tie. And then there's the people that you know, but you don't know all that well, which is what you said, that those weak ties, right? And these people are very, very distant from you in terms of the larger network, 7.7 billion people, or the network of your city, or whatever you want to zoom it down into, because there's a term in network science called transitivity, which is most of the people that you know usually know each other. Those close contacts that you have usually know each other. If A knows B and B knows C, there's a really strong chance that A and C know each other. So the only way to escape that kind of constant cycle is to go distant. And this is why a lot of people associate networking with meeting strangers. They're making that effort to go distant, which I get. But now we're relying on like serendipity, right? We're just hoping that that total stranger that we meet is also a resource for that thing that we needed, right? Instead of realizing that there are people who are as distant as strangers, but we already know a little bit about them. We already know whether or not they'd be likely people who can help us, or let's go in reverse too, or that we could help them, because that's a lot of what building a good network and reputation inside the network is about. It's a give as well. And so those are your weak and dormant ties. And those are the people you're probably ignoring. And yes, I mean, you look at the research on how people get hired, it's almost always through that friend of a friend. That's why the book is called that. That acquaintance connection, that someone distant from you knows somebody else and connects the two of you. And that's what the most likely chances of finding that A player are, right? But we skip over that. We go and ask our close friends and then we jump right to strangers. And so we call it in a subtitle, the hidden network. The hidden network is literally those people that you already know that you're forgetting, and you're forgetting to ask them those simple questions. And I get it, like, especially when you're really needy, it can feel awkward. It can feel odd. And that's why I think most people would benefit from a system where they are constantly pinging those people whenever they come into your mind. Most of your weak or dormant ties, at some point in the last, I'll even say 6 months, there was some triggering event that made you think of them. You heard a news report. You read an article online, right? For some reason, the gods of the Facebook algorithm actually remembered to put their status in your timeline, whatever it is, right? There was some triggering moment where you thought of them and you just let it drift by. What if instead we just captured that moment, took the 30 seconds it takes to forward that article that made us think of that person to that person, right? Or even if you're just walking down the street and they pop into your head, I get a lot of traction out of simple emails like, hey, I was thinking about you today and I hope you're well. No reply needed, because I don't need anything in that moment and you probably don't need anything either. And yet I'll often get back paragraphs of here's what I'm going through and what I'm up to, and we should book a time to jump on Zoom and chat, right? So that system of regularly reaching back out to those weak and dormant ties makes it much more likely that when you actually need to find a new employee, right, when you need to hire the best, you're much more likely to find them because you can go back to those people, and it's just one in a series of conversations that you have with those weak and dormant ties while they're scanning the edges of your network for new people to bring into it for you. And that is a huge competitive advantage in hiring the A players, but also if you're an A player, in being hired by companies you want to go to work for. It goes both ways.
Absolutely. And I have to say, just, as you're describing that, I'm thinking about what's happening in my world with this book launch going on. I've had just in the last 2 weeks, I'm counting 4 people who I would consider weak ties, dormant ties from the past, reach out and say, hey, I see you have a book launch coming up. Can I help you in this way? Can you, do you want to be on my blog or my podcast? And that's exactly that phenomenon that we need to, and I love what you're saying, let's just be systematic about when those people come into our minds, reaching out and connecting in that way. That way, when we do have something that we need, it's not an awkward, like, hey, I'm really desperate here for an employee. Can you help me out? Do you know anybody who might fit this criteria? The other part of friend of a friend that I find really fascinating is the concept of brokers and understanding how to be a broker, and if you know a broker, what that means, and how to just really tap into networks through brokers. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so brokers help you sell your house. No, I'm kidding. So networks are not egalitarian. If you were to graph out who's connected to whom and how, it wouldn't look like a piece of graph paper that we used to use in math class, right? It looks like the spider webs. There are little clusters and then there are distant things, and the whole thing is kind of confusing. And those clusters are a result of the fact that like attracts like, that people who know A players hang out with other A players, right? that all of that, we're attracted to people who think like us, act like us, have a similar background, and that creates nooks and crannies. The problem is that when you're creating those clusters, it's almost like a gravitational pull. The more those clusters pull new people to them, the more empty space is between those two different clusters, right? I mean, I'll give you a great example of this. We're in the United States, and it feels like people who vote one way don't even understand the people who vote the other way. Right? And I don't care which way anybody votes, right? But we as a society right now, and we go through ebbs and flows of this, it's happened before, but people pull away from each other. And when that happens, it happens in large organizations too. As soon as you have, in my experiences, truthfully, as soon as you have, let's say, half a dozen to a dozen employees, there begin to be cliques. But as a result of the job function, but also as a result of sort of personality similarities, people talk to some people in the company way more often than other companies. And that's the beginning of what we call silos, politics, and turf wars, to quote Patrick Lencioni, right? Now, that doesn't mean that there's no hope, because in network science, there's a term for people that actually make a deliberate effort to connect those two clusters. We call them brokers. And brokers can be people who deliberately did it, people who work in accounting that said, you know what, I don't know anything about marketing. I'm going to actually embed myself with those people, take them out to lunch or what have you. Or they can be the result of job transitions or something like that. I mean, the reason that 7.7 billion people are connected by 4 to 6 degrees of separation is that some people move halfway across the planet. And so they act as this giant leap that you can take. Those people are brokers. And it turns out in an organization, in an industry, just inside of a business, or if you're looking for an A player, those brokers are going to be the people that are going to help you get connected to those communities as well. The big key is figuring out if you're already a broker or if you are relying on brokers. And so what I encourage a lot of people to do is audit your calendar, look at make a list of maybe the top 25 people that you interact with the most, and then start to think about, how did I meet this person? Right? Was I introduced to this person? Did I meet them serendipitously? Who introduced me to them? Most people meet someone through somebody else, right? So who did it? If you see the same name in that who did it column, you know who the broker in your life is, right? Because it's the person that introduced you to 7 out of the 25 people that you interact with the most, right? If there's nobody on that list, right, then that's an indication that you might be a broker. But let's go one column out further and go, who have you introduced that person to? Right? And if that column is largely empty, you're mostly making your connections through serendipity and you're not really being deliberate about your network. If that column's full of names of people that you've introduced the people closest to you are, then you're probably a broker, right? So there's a ton of value that gets unlocked from being a broker, but you have to know if you are one already. And if not, you have to decide whether or not you want to make the deliberate effort to be one.
Yeah, well, and I think when it comes to recruiting A players, if we're not the broker, looking in our network and seeing who are the brokers. And easy example that comes to mind is if you bring in a new team member, they have come from some other place of employment. They have access. They can be your broker to that network over there of other team members who may also want to come to work with you.
Yeah, well, and this is where it can get a little dangerous too, right? Because if you're hiring them all from that same community, that can be a problem, right? Like in the book, we talk about Gimlet, the podcasting company. And early on, they're doing a way better job with this now. But early on, they kind of did a diversity audit and they realized that they had a lot of men and women on staff, equal representation, but they were all former NPR employees who made a very specific sounding podcast, and that was it. And they realized they were missing people of color, quite frankly, especially women of color. And so they started auditing their own networks, and they realized that they had brokers to NPR and other public radio producers, but they didn't have brokers to, the world of sort of urban radio, right? Or to people that did movie documentaries as opposed to audio. And so the founders especially had to make a deliberate effort to go find brokers in that community. They themselves had to go embed themselves in those clusters for a little while until they found enough people. So yes, your employees are brokers to those former companies, and so they're going to help you out. But you also want to make sure that you are looking for brokers that come from a diversity of places, because that's the other thing you want if you're trying to hire the best, is you want to hire the best from all fields so you can benefit from their different perspectives, not just steal the best from one company, then you're just that company.
Right. So diversity with your brokers. And that reminds me of, because I've also read your other book, Under New Management. Now, everything is kind of melding together in my head.
It does it in mine too, trust me.
Yeah. But in Under New Management, you talk about, I think you call it, put your org chart in pencil, keep it flexible. And the same concept is in that we want our teams to be mixing and not having the same people interacting all the time, because that's where you lose the freshness of ideas. So you want to have people flowing in and out of teams, but there's a certain curve, I think, where it's productive for that and effective for that to happen. But if a team comes together and stays together too long, then it loses the effectiveness.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's not enough to just build a diverse team, because the team, the longer it works together, will be less and less diverse. I mean, the traditional sort of markers of diversity, gender, ethnicity, identity, et cetera, those will always be there, right? But in terms of cognitive diversity, the longer they work together, the more they will think alike, right? If you don't believe me, talk to any couple that's been married for 40 years or more, right? They look alike, right? It gets a little crazy, right? So we want to have that kind of constant refreshing. And that's why we say, write the org chart in pencil. It's not that we do away with the org chart and create one of these companies where no one has any managers and everything is sort of crazy. That's almost too much. We want some level of structure, but we also want a mechanism in place to be refreshing the network of the organization so that people are constantly meeting new people. You can do this in a couple different ways, right? So a lot of companies will restructure, and instead of have the org chart be based on who you report to, it's almost based on the project. And depending on what project we're working on, we're going to be assembling different teams with different team leaders. Some companies go as small as just doing things like, my favorite is the company IDEO for a long time had this thing they called help time. It was sort of their version of the 3M or Google 20% time, where you could work on whatever project you want. Their idea was 5% of your week, we would love for you to be working with some other project team. Right? You're not officially stationed to them. You don't answer to them, but jump in on a focus group, jump in on a brainstorming session, just go out to lunch with that team so that you're helping them. They're benefiting from your perspective, but you're also getting to know people much more often. And by the way, the reason that your mind melded there is that we cited the same studies in Under New Management and in Friend of a Friend, because in Friend of a Friend, we looked at it as at the individual level, right, which is building teams from all over your network. On a personal level, most of the time when you have a problem, you go back to the same 4 or 5 people that you trust to give you advice. And that's a huge problem, because like, if they were so brilliant, why do you still have the problem? A, but B, the longer you go back to those people, the more they'll think like you, and their answers won't provide you any new perspective, right? So you need a mechanism in place for your own life to make sure that you're building teams based on the problem that you're facing, that you need help with, not just based on these are the 5 or 6 people closest to me, so I always bring my problems to them.
So we need to continually diversify our teams in terms of perspectives, life experiences, that sort of thing, in order to keep our own thinking fresh. So that's a big takeaway here. One of the other points that you make in Under New Management is the concept of no email. And I love that. As I was sharing with you when we started the conversation, that as I was reading Under New Management, I was kind of going through it as a checklist of, yes, we do that. Oh, no, we don't do that. We should be doing that. That'll be on the list for next year. We're going to change that. But the no email in Under New Management really caught my attention, because just this past year within my business, Tap the Potential, we have gone to using Slack for internal team communication and also for communication with our clients. And I really encourage my team to take care of their headspace. So even though Slack will notify us all the time of, notifications, and it'll ding us and whatever, turn that off and just really focus when you need to focus, and when you're ready to come up for air and connect with other people, then check into Slack. But I would love to hear you talk some about why getting away from email can be beneficial, and how is it doable?
Yeah, well, you just said the biggest thing right there, which is that even if you move to a different tool, make sure you're taking the time to turn notifications off, right? So email was the first in a series of offensive communication technologies. Not offensive in the sense that they're full of swear words or something like that, but just they're interruptive way too often, right? It used to be that, a lot of people I talk to can't remember these days, but it used to be that at work, you had a desk, and on that desk was a phone and an inbox. And the phone could only ring when you were at the desk to answer it, right? And the inbox had paper in it where people wrote memos and then passed them out to you. And so when you were at work, you were at work. And when you were at home, you were at home. Well, now, if you have a smartphone in your pocket, you take your work home with you every single night, right? There's no escaping it. But we can give you a couple little hacks that you can sort of do on that. But that's created a big problem where people feel like they need to be on 24/7, right? But even when they're at work, the level of interruption that email can be, if it's constant, I mean, checking the email every 5 minutes, some Outlook with like 365 or other IT departments will set up push email, which is a fancy word for we're going to ping you every time someone sends you an email, right? So now go back to that office from 30 years ago. Imagine the phone just never stops ringing. How in the world would you get anything done at work either, right? We know the research suggests that when you're deep focused on a task and you're interrupted, it takes 20 minutes to get back to that level of focus. But if your email is going off every 5 minutes, how do you ever get back to that level of focus, right? So pulling away from that, being able to just turn it off so you can focus is the real key around this. Most companies, because at the time, like that was the big thing, most companies used internal email because it was the only offensive technology. Now, I mean, I think Slack is a wonderful tool because you can open and close it way easier than sort of email, right? You can go to the well when you want to join the communication and you can pull away from it when you want to be alone. And that's the big key, right? For some people, it may not be that we ban internal email, but we take steps to put limits on after hours email, right? So there are companies that are now shutting the email servers off after 6 p.m. So you could still go into your inbox if you're that type of person that wants to do that, and you can click reply and you can compose replies to all your emails, but they won't send until 8 a.m. the next day, right? Which is, again, a great technology that lets people pull away from work, because we also know that time away from work makes work better. Right?
Yes.
So that's the really big key. You want to attack internal email, great. You want to switch to Slack, like great. Some people go to Basecamp, right? Whatever the tool is. The point is that we need to stop this sort of constant stream of interruptions, because none of that creates value. Unless you're in customer service, reactive work almost never creates value. And unless we're giving people time to do proactive work, we're hiring them and then not letting them create any value.
Yeah. And I know, just as you were talking about like work and life 30 years ago, I remember when email first came into my world. I was a graduate student at the University of Texas at Austin, and I was probably 2 or 3 years in. And I found email to be a great way when I was procrastinating on writing my dissertation to go check my email and connect with my friends. And that was kind of like the gateway drug for email in my life. And now the way I think about how I relate to email now, I hate email. And so I just love having a much more effective way for the people that I want to be connecting with on a regular basis to be communicating with us in Slack. And really having that opportunity to get out in front and say to our team, you know you can receive a notification in Slack anytime I message you, but I really don't want you responding on Saturday or in the middle of the night just because I may be awake thinking of something. Doesn't mean you should respond to me in the middle of the night on Saturday. And so as an employer, I have learned that I have to be aware that if I send that message on Saturday and they have their notifications turned on, I have created a huge disruption for them. So that's been something for me to learn. I got to manage myself a little better so that I can help my team take care of themselves.
Yeah, no, I mean, so this is a big one for middle managers, senior leaders, business owners, et cetera, is that when it comes to electronic communication, people are paying way more attention to what you're doing than to what you're saying. So you're saying, oh, I don't want my team to work nights and weekends, but you're working nights and weekends. The subtle message that you're saying is that we're the type of organization that responds whenever problems come up. So, why weren't you there? And it's subtle too, right? You might even not want a response, right? Let's say you send a message at 11 o'clock on Wednesday, right? And you don't want a response at 11 o'clock on Wednesday, but so many times it's really easy to walk into work and the first thing you say is, hey, did you see my email? Well, no, I didn't see your email because it's 8 in the morning and I haven't actually gotten to work and checked your email yet. But yet that subtle message is like, oops, I should have been in the car reading there, or checking my phone on the train in because I was expected to see that. And that can be really corrosive too. It's not intentional, but it's those little ways that we think, oh, I just want to get ahead of it so that I'm ready for tomorrow. And in reality, we're making everyone else feel behind, and that can have a huge problem as well.
Yeah, that really, in terms of the culture in the workplace, I love what you're saying. That's a subtle message. It's an unintended message that we're sending, so we need to be mindful of that. It also in terms of culture and creating a great place to work, because that's a big part of how to hire the best is if you want to attract A players, you need to have a good culture for them to come to work in. One of the concepts that you talk about in under new management is extending trust to team members. And you write about it in the chapter about getting rid of vacation policies and just letting people have vacation as they want it. But what really was fascinating to me is you talk about the science of oxytocin and what happens for us in our bodies when trust is extended and how we reciprocate around that.
Yeah. And I am indebted to a friend of mine, Paul Zak, who's a brilliant researcher in around this idea. But what Zak basically discovered is that trust isn't given and trust isn't earned. Trust is reciprocated. At a chemical level, the chemical in your body, you already said, is oxytocin. It's, love chemical. It's like it comes, I don't know how to not get crude. It shows up in your body in a lot of different situations. One of them being trust, right? And what we find is that acts of being vulnerable with someone, in other words, trusting them, because all trust requires vulnerability, make you, when you feel trusted, you are much more likely to exhibit trustworthy behavior, right? So we kind of have, and maybe it's a Western thing, I don't really know, we kind of have this deal that you have to earn trust from other people. Chemically, it doesn't work like that. Chemically, it takes a first person stepping out and going, I have no idea if you're going to take advantage of me or not, but I'll never actually give you and myself the opportunity to get into this trust loop, this reciprocal thing, unless I step out and be vulnerable around it, right? And we see this in little economics games where they would play where depending on the turn it was, et cetera, you have this chance of ripping off the person that you're playing this game with in the laboratory. They find out that the higher levels of oxytocin in the first person, the more likely they are to trust the second person. The more that second person feels trusted, the less likely they are to rip people off. And it's just this positive upward cycle, right? Now, fast forward to organizations. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations have policy creep, right? Or procedure creep. Someone took advantage of the company once. And basically we said, I'm never going to let that happen again. Therefore, boom, here's the policy, right? Here's the expense report policy because one person accidentally ordered like the 12-ounce steak instead of a burger at the restaurant. And now I'm mad because they abused my, like really? Why don't you just fire that one person and let everybody else work trustworthy-wise, right? And so the example that I use in the book is a relatively well-known example now is the company Netflix that was when they were preparing to go public, they realized that there was all sorts of stuff they were going to have to do to bring their vacation policy kind of in line with what the accounting firms all wanted. And at the same time, there were employees being like, well, look, we work whenever kind of we want. We work from home or at the office. We don't tell you what hours we're working during the day. Why do you need to know what days we're working during the week? And senior leadership was like, yeah, actually, you're exactly right. So they went back to the accountants and they said, is there any law that says we have to have a vacation policy? Like you told us if we have one, we have to have these minimum standards. But is there a law that says we have one? And they basically said, no, there's not. So they went to this unlimited vacation policy. They took a step out and trusted employees first. And the employees responded by feeling trusted. The research, or the surveys, I should say, show that when a company goes to unlimited vacation, the average number of days worked stays about the same. The wings get wider. In other words, some people do take a lot less vacation. Whether they feel internal pressure to or not, it's a whole other debate for like an hour-long interview that we could go into. Some people take way more. And I think that speaks to the idea that, truthfully, this is a policy that should be about trust instead of about a one-size-fits-all number of days off from work, right? I have a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old, and my wife also works, right? So if I'm that type of employee, I mean, I'm totally unemployable at this point in my life. But if I were that type of employee, I have very different demands for work than myself 8 years ago when we had no kids and had all sorts of time because my wife was in medical school, right? And I have very different demands than 20 years from now when all of my kids are grown and I'm just trying to sort of like grow that last little achievements in my career and what have you. So there's no sort of one size fits all policy. And in fact, the irony is that most companies say, well, you earn more vacation days the longer you stay here. Meaning the older you are as an employee, the more vacation days you get when you need them less.
The least.
Right?
Yeah.
So the only real solution is to say, you know what? We're not going to nickel and dime you. We realize we can't do something that works for everybody. We trust you to act responsibly. And most employees respond in kind. 1 out of 100 will take advantage of you, and you invite that person to be successful at a different company, right? But for everybody else, you show that you trust them. And by the way, in the Netflix example, the switch to saying, we trust you, here's vacation, worked so well that within a couple months, they changed their expense reimbursement policy to 5 words, act in Netflix's best interest. We don't have to submit a report. You don't have to do whatever. We'll reimburse whatever you say you expend, but act in our best interest.
So I think this is such a critical point, because what you're pointing out is if we want to have a great place to work and we want to attract A players, we need to make sure that our policies and how we conduct ourselves is in alignment with A player behavior. A players don't abuse vacation policy. Right? A players act responsibly. A players take into account the company's best interest in their decision making. And so I think it's so easy in our businesses when we've been burned by employees to say, all right, I'm putting a new policy in place. We're not going to let this happen again. And what we're doing is we're catering to those C and D players that we don't want in the business to begin with, but all of our policies and procedures get designed around them. And even before I read the book, so I can't give credit to, I read the book and I implemented it because David said this. We've started a vacation policy at my business, Tap the Potential, and it has nothing about how many days you can have off. There's no wording about that in there. It just says, make sure there's coverage for the small groups, because that's our core function. And so if you're facilitating, check with another team member and make sure there's coverage, and then be gone as much as you want or as little as you want. And in my experience, I find I actually have to tell my team to be off. And that's A player behavior. They are so invested in what they're doing that they have to be encouraged to take that time off and disconnect and take that vacation.
Yeah, well, and that's what we see in a lot of organizations that make unlimited vacation work for them. That's one of the big things we have to see too. Senior leaders have to be actually kind of showy about how little they're around. Like, especially in North America, we brag about how much we work, right? Not how little we work. And so you've got to kind of flip it and be really showy about, you know what, I'm leaving for 3 weeks, right? Or 4 weeks or whatever it is, so that people get the message that this is actually okay. And there are other companies that maybe don't do the unlimited vacation policy thing. And I would classify this more as a sabbatical than an unlimited vacation. But they'll do things like paid vacation, where it's like, we really want you to take a week or two off, especially right here because we're between projects. So not only is it paid time off, but like, if you take a vacation in the next 2 weeks, we'll pay you extra money because we really want you rested, right? Or like my favorite example that we found in the entire book, that was Motley Fool, another investment reports company. We'll do this thing called basically the surprise vacation. They'll pull someone's name from a hat, and that person has 5 days to organize and take a vacation. And if they do, the company pays for everything and gives them a bonus. And if they can't do it, like they lose, they don't get to use those days some other time. It's just, we randomly decided you're the one who gets the vacation right now. You got to take it in the next couple of days, right? And there's we could debate the fairness of pulling a name out of a hat, but I just love the idea of like, no, we're so serious about this that we're going to pay you, not just for the time you're taking off. We're going to pay you to go somewhere else and get some rest.
Yeah. So since you brought up bragging about vacation, I think this is a perfect segue in here to talk about what we do at Tap the Potential, which is the 4-week vacation challenge. And so with these entrepreneurs, talk about having to send somebody on vacation and wrestle the business away from them and say, no, you need to go. We had to make a whole vacation challenge to get entrepreneurs to leave. And what I really appreciate about Under New Management is you talk about the benefits when leaders leave, what benefits get created in the company from that happening. We've seen that with our business owner clients when they leave, but you have some research that backs this up. So I want you to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. And this is deliberately provocative. I apologize. But the reality is that if you can't leave on 24 hours notice and disappear for a week, you're doing your company a disservice because you have no idea what's going to happen to you, right? You might get hit by a bus tomorrow. Nobody gets hit by buses anymore, but you know what I mean? You might fall asleep and never wake up. We don't know. And presumably you started the business to enrich more people than just you. And so if the business relies on you and you can't remove yourself from that really, really quickly and have it keep going, maybe not forever, but for enough time, right? You're doing a huge disservice to all of the other people there. In fancy terms, we call this a sabbatical. You need to be able to take 4 weeks is a great number, right? Because it's enough time to actually pull away. For a lot of leaders, it's not about how much time you take away. Anytime you can pull away, time away from work makes work better. We know this. Usually the studies of sabbaticals are done in the academic world because professors get sabbaticals every 7 years. But more and more companies are doing it for their executives. And we see in the research of people that go that the more they pull away from campus, the more that they pull away from the office, whatever it is, the more that they learn outside of it to bring new ideas and resources and creativity back to the organization, and the better their performance when they come back. The bigger thing that I like is there's a study done on leaders of nonprofit organizations that encourage them to take exactly the same number as you. I believe it was 4-week sabbatical. And what happened is it allowed the organization to stress test new leaders, right? So when you leave for 4 weeks, when you accept the 4-week challenge, you have to decide who's taking responsibility for this, who's taking responsibility for that. And those people get to step up into new leadership roles, and you can see how they do instead of promoting them and then having to deal with the fact that it's sort of a total failure, right? Like, what's the old joke about the Peter principle, that people always get promoted to their level of incompetence? Why? Because you did a good job here, so we'll promote you. You did a good job here, we'll promote you. And then right here, we figured out that you're pretty terrible, and we're not going to fire you, right? Because that would be mean. And we're not going to demote you because that would be awkward. We'll just leave you here and hope you figure it out, right? Well, sabbatical is a 4-week vacation. That's the anti-Peter principle, right? Because you're letting people try out this role before we do it. And then like, they were a great fit, we're all set to go. They were a terrible fit, don't even consider them for that role. Or usually somewhere in the middle, we tried it and we realized that this over here is a developmental area that we're going to work on before we promote you. The only way to really figure out whether or not somebody's going to be a good leader is to let them try being a leader. And if you don't step out from the organization to let that happen, then who are you handing the company to down the road? Or what would happen if you did get hit by said proverbial bus and somebody had to step up tomorrow, but nobody was ready? What would happen? It would be, again, presumably you started a business and began hiring employees and things like that to create something that enriches more than you. But if all of them are reliant on you, you're not actually enriching them as much as you think.
Yeah, absolutely. And, another good point that you make around the vacation and being totally off and unplugged is an important one, because a lot of times we see entrepreneurs who will say, oh yeah, I could go away for 2 or 3 weeks. I'll just, on Saturdays, I'll need to bring my laptop and check in on a few things, make sure payroll goes through, those sorts of things. But that is a disruption of that downtime that we need to recharge and get those creative juices flowing. And so that actually undermines that. And I think in the book, you cited some research about what happens when someone is checking in when they're supposed to be away.
Yeah. So basically it was looking at that. It was looking at faculty members who would leave for a sabbatical and then judging them on how detached they would be. So some people take like a Fulbright scholarship, for example, and go halfway around the world and just focus on their research. Other people pull back and learn a new skill or what have you. And some people go, great, I don't have to teach this semester. And then they still show up on campus, or they still check their campus email, or they're still showing up for meetings, even though they're not have any other responsibilities. And then looking at their productivity for 2 or 3 years after they took that. And it was very, very clear that the people that pulled back further, not just because they were spending more time on research, mind you, they're controlling for that, but because they pulled back further, they were far more productive in the 2 or 3 years after the sabbatical. If anything, the people over here, it was kind of a waste. We gave them all that time off. They had no real productivity gains. We didn't really get anything out of it. So it cost us a ton and we didn't get the benefit. And it's their waste, right? They had this opportunity and they squandered it, right? So I think you're exactly right. And again, if you feel like you've got to check in every Saturday morning to make sure the payroll went out on Friday, like, first of all, what are you going to do? People's paycheck already didn't show up, right? That's just to use that hypothetical example. But if you feel like you've got to keep doing that, you should probably audit how well you've built the people underneath you. Because if you don't feel like you're ready to do that, that's kind of a leadership flaw to a certain extent. That means you haven't sort of groomed those people to take over for you, which is a big problem.
Right. That's an area of growth for the leader to be working on that for sure. So there's the other point that you make in the book is about getting rid of performance, the annual performance review. Oh my gosh, that is something. When I was an employee, I remember every year how much I hated that experience going through it. And I remember having to be one who gives employee performance reviews, how painful that is and time consuming. Oh my gosh. And so with, these entrepreneurs and small businesses, they're wearing so many hats already. The thought of having to do an annual performance review on all the team members is really daunting. So you have, under new management, you pretty much say, ditch the employee performance review.
Yeah, basically. The thing that I find amazing, especially when talking with entrepreneurs, small business owners, et cetera, is that if they do a performance appraisal, I always ask a follow-up question, which is, great, where did you learn to do it, right? And almost always they tell me, oh, I kind of worked with what we used to do at the company that I was employed by before I quit to start this business. I'm like, really? Because presumably you left corporate America, employment world, because there was something that annoyed you and you decided you could do it better yourself. And then you just were like, oh, well, I guess we got to do this, so I better steal it from that company that I hated working at, right? I don't need research for that. That's just a cognitive weirdness to me. But yeah, the interesting thing is the goal of an annual performance review is a really, really great one, right? And there are organizations that don't do annual performance reviews and do nothing, and they are far worse off than companies that do the annual review. But the problem happens when we said, great, we want to give employees feedback. We want to make performance better. So we're going to start this annual ritual of the performance review. And that kind of gave a pass to everyone to not care that much about feedback in between those years, right? That was the first thing that kind of went off the rails. The second thing that happened is then we started saying, well, based on those performance reviews, we'll adjust your pay. Okay, well, now I'm not really looking for feedback in this conversation. Now I'm lobbying you on why I deserve that bigger bonus, right? So that's like problem 2. And problem 3 is usually a lot of times we attach these artificial rules on it. Like everyone is below expectations, meets expectations, exceeds expectations, but you can only tell 2 people they exceed expectations. Why 2? That's kind of arbitrary, right? So you end up getting this, like you see it with a lot of large organizations, you end up getting this like horse trading between managers to where like, well, I only have 1 that exceeds expectations, so I'll let you use 1 of mine, and next year I need 1. And now we're not talking about real feedback that makes people better, right? We know a couple different things about feedback that can actually improve performance. The first and biggest one is that it needs to happen relatively closely to the actual incident of observed performance, right? If you're not giving feedback at a time where people can actually remember what they did, right, then you're not going to get those performance gains anyway. And most of the time with an annual review, you might be commenting on behaviors that happened 9 months ago that you documented, and the employee is like either A, I don't remember that, or B, like it's been 9 months and I've grown since that, so your feedback isn't relevant to me. Right, so we know that about feedback. It should probably be divorced from that conversation of good or bad employee and whether or not you're going to get a promotion and that sort of stuff, because that makes it kind of a game, right? And so a lot of companies are having a ton of success with saying, all right, forget it. Let's just throw the performance review out. And in all of the hours that you just mentioned that are wasted is a strong term, the hours required to give an annual performance review, let's train our managers on how to coach people. Let's train them on how to have a conversation about expectations, about feedback, about their own careers. The companies that I actually admire the most are the ones that are doing this informally and in an undocumented way, because then you can have a real conversation, right? Like ask this of any business. Almost every business owner I know has had this situation. You've got an A player, right? She's worked at your company for 2 or 3 years. You do that annual feedback conversation. She tells you about how she wants to work for you, forever. She wants to grow in the company, what have you. And 3 months later, she's gone. She might be gone because she got a better offer. She might be gone because she's married and her spouse got a job in Cleveland and they have to move. There's a myriad of different reasons, but like, wouldn't it have been better if 2 months ago, like they were honest with you about what was going on in their life that might affect that? Like, even if you had no control over the fact that they were leaving because they're married and their spouse is going to go, like in my situation, their spouse is going to go start medical school and they need to move too or not be a spouse anymore. Like, even if you can't do anything about the fact that they're leaving, wouldn't you still rather know so that you can plan for it, right? And those things only happen when you're willing to just have that informal conversation that's not tied to your rating or your bonus or that kind of thing. And so we call that coaching, right? That is performance coaching 101. And that goes a whole lot further than this annual ritual that we do of filling out a barely editable Word document that someone from HR gave us.
Well, and I think too, what we were talking about earlier around trust, when we're having those conversations on a weekly basis, a regular basis, we're building up a real relationship with that person. And they're much more comfortable saying, I'm probably going to look at having to move here in the next few months. As much as I love this job, my spouse is going to go to medical school and I'm probably going to have to move. So the trust that comes from those regular conversations creates the open door, the real person to come out and the real issues to come out so they can be addressed.
Right. And particularly on the departing employees and that sort of thing, how you treat them from the moment they announce that like our time together is coming to an end has a huge effect, not to bring it all home, but has a huge effect on whether or not they become ambassadors for your company down the road, right? You want to build a great place to work, build a great place to have worked as well, right? And take care of those people because they're those weak ties. They're the dormant ties. They're going to be sending you new A players. But if you treat it like a betrayal, if you're angry, if you're just like, we're done because you decided to leave, that's not going to help you bring new good employees to you, right? So you stand a much better chance to get into that trust piece that when those situations happen, continuing to care about that person's career, even if it means their employment with you is coming to an end, not only is it just the right thing to do, it works a whole lot better for you in the long term as well.
Well, because they could be brokers, right? And bring you new team members and they become a dormant tie down the road that you may want to connect with. And who knows where that could lead. So I know you are constantly studying management practices and what works. So as we wrap up today, I would love to hear from you. Like if you see one thing out on the horizon that is something that most leaders are not aware of that they could be doing to make a great place to work, what would you say that is?
Well, you brought me the horizon question, and I don't know that I can answer that. I will say this, just as by way of a reframe for a lot of what we've been talking about. It's really easy to hear a conversation like this and go, oh, shoot, now I have to add this, I have to add this, I have to add this. Everything we've talked about in the realm of sort of management, right? Everything we've talked about is actually not an addition, it's a subtraction. This was blocking our A players from doing their best work. The vacation policy made them not feel trusted. The performance evaluation wasn't giving them the feedback they needed, right? Email was interrupting them at all times. It's actually a policy of subtraction. So yes, you can do all of the things that we were just talking about. But the biggest lesson to take away from all of this, I think, is that it's incumbent on you to figure out what's preventing your A players from doing their best work and then find a way to remove it. And that might look like things that we've talked about, but it might look like something totally different. But what it will do is set them free. My friend Orly LaBelle has this great book title that I wish I could have stolen, but now she already wrote a book on it. Talent wants to be free, right? Talent wants autonomy. And so the best thing you can do is figure out where do they feel like they're chained down and cut those chains and let them do their best work. Wow.
I love that. That is powerful. And I immediately internally felt this sense of weight coming off my shoulders. As you said, this is about subtracting things and making things easier, not just for the A players, but for the business owners and the leaders in the business as well. So thank you for that. That's a great aha.
Oh, my pleasure.
I appreciate you being here with us, David. Where could our listeners learn more about you and stay on top of what you're up to next?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the best place, if you're listening to this, is the show notes for this episode because they're there and they're going to have all the links. My name's really easy, Burkus, David Burkus. There's not a lot of us in the world. And so if you type it into Google, you'll find me wherever you want to find me. But the easiest thing to do is just hook up with the show and go through their notes and we'll be good to go. And please do reach out and converse because, again, all of these things constantly move. That idea around subtraction means there are new things to subtract. And so I'd love to keep the conversation going with everybody who's listening.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thank you for spending time with us today. Join our conversation in the Profit by Design podcast Facebook group. Share your thoughts on today's episode, ask us questions, and let us know what you want to hear about next. Visit our website at profitbydesignpodcast.com to access resources from our sponsors and tools we've created for you. Subscribe to the show on whatever platform you're listening to right now. There's a subscribe button right there. Go ahead and hit it so that you always get a notification when we release a new episode. And finally, share our podcast with a friend if you know a friend who would enjoy it. Thanks again for listening. This is real life business. Keep your chin up, keep moving forward. You got this.